I can just skip through some of the beginning stuff. Yeah, I was in Kurdistan all of this fall, and it was great to be back on the ground for 4 months. And it reminded me again, what journalists know is that it's so important to be on the ground. You can watch things from afar. There's so much you can do now with social media, with news media, but being there is just so much different. I'm afraid that the good part of this talk is pretty short. The good part were my students. They were wonderful. I was teaching a reporting class at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. Suleimani is in the Kurdish region. English language institution, fairly new. Got great research interviews, working with a really good fixer and translator. I actually had students who came to me and who said, hey, you know, we want to do a conference on impunity against journalists. And I was going, well, that's a good idea, because there's a lot of it in this region. And this is the whole UN International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. I had never even heard of it, I have to confess. But these students were determined they were going to do this big conference. And they did. Look at this big fancy brochure they have, and you know, and they brought in, you know, journalists from all over. So that was really impressive. I thought that students took it upon themselves. And I said to them, why do you want to do this? You're not even in journalism. And they said, well, we all know journalists who have been killed or kidnapped or other, you know, or jailed, and we think it's really important. So I was pretty happy. Suleimania is a wonderful city. And one of my students did a story about the brand new women's bookstore, a woman-run bookstore that opened downtown. And when I went in there, there was a Peshmerga soldier sitting there furiously reading. It's really a nice city, and I wanted to tell graduate students that it's a great place to work, it's a great place to do research. I was reminded again of how warm and fuzzy the Kurds are. People were really helpful. People were really what I liked about interview, alatul, as the Arabs would say, they're really straightforward. No one hesitates, no one gives you BS. They just tell you what they think. They're not afraid to tell you what they think. So it was pretty important for me as a researcher. I want to place Kurdistan, before I talk about what was going on with the referendum and the backlash to it, I want to kind of place the Kurds in the region, because I think it's really important to understand their position in the region. As all, you know, you guys all study the Middle East, you know there was supposed to be a Kurdish state carved out of the moribund Ottoman Empire. And the Brits and the French, when they were carving it up, they were going to make a Kurdish state. When it came to the second treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, I always get them mixed up. Was that the second one? Lausanne and Sèvres? Yeah. There was no state there. Partially because, of course, Ataturk had risen up and was establishing the nation of Turkey. And also oil was found here near Kirkuk, and I think the Brits just couldn't resist that. So the Kurds didn't have it together. They were still very traditional, tiny little nation states, little tribal entities. They didn't have it together. But what it means is that the region carved up, we've got Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and it left the Kurds as large minorities in each of those countries. And it's really important, I think, to understand that they're not just a teeny little minority. They are kind of in Syria, but we can see right now what an important role they're playing in Syria in furthering violence and chaos, though not their fault. But anyway, so you've got these large minorities in, you know, a predominantly Persian country, predominantly 2 Arab countries, a Turkish state, all busy trying to build a nation. And you've got this large group of ethnic Kurds who don't want to be part of that nationalist project. They want their own independence. This has been throughout their history, their modern history. What that means is, and this is really important, is that the Kurds are always looking for a patron, for a big brother to protect them, to take them by the hand and help them stand up against, you know, the Arab government or the Persian government or the Turkish government. And because of that, they're always used and manipulated, right? I mean, the classic case was, of course, Nixon and Kissinger with the Shah of Iran. They decided in the 70s, they decided they were going to fund the Kurds who would further their rebellion against Baghdad, against Saddam. Was in power by that time. The Shah of Iran was trying to poke a stick. So they gave lots of money and training. It was this bizarre scene of having, I think, Israeli trainers and weapons that the Israelis had taken in their wars further west and given to the Kurds. It was like a 3-year rebellion, and then suddenly Iran and Iraq came to an agreement, because what Iran really wanted was the access to the waterway here. What Iran wanted, they got access to the Shatt al-Arab. Algiers agreement, boom, they withdrew all their support. Horrible betrayal of the Kurds by the US. Tens of thousands were slaughtered because, of course, the government just moved up into this region. The Kurds tried to take refuge in Iran. Iran closed the border. They were just slaughtered. So this, you know, there's been these series of betrayals of the Kurds by the US, and yet they still keep thinking that somehow the US is going to back them up, which is what they thought with this referendum. But again, just to keep in mind, they are a threatening minority. They want independence always. The Iraqi Kurds have been pretty quiet about it over the past decade or so until recently, and we'll get to that in a second. But they're always looking for a big brother, which means they are often used and manipulated, you know, through their own fault. But because of this weird position, and as a Kurdish leader once told me, he said, "We are an island in a sea of sharks." Meaning that, you know, nobody wishes them well in their neighborhood. Also, just wanted to remind you of the ethnic and sectarian composition in Iraq. About 20% Sunni Arab, about 20% Kurds, who are mostly Sunni also, but much less so now after having ISIS on their doorstep. People reverting to Zoroastrianism as an alternative to, or atheism, and then 60% Shia Arabs. And so, you know, as you all know, for their history, of course, the Sunni Arabs largely dominated. They were put on the throne by the British and through the colonial period, and then up through the Ba'ath Party. This minority, Sunni Arabs, always ruled. And the Kurds, you know, have always kind of been at different stages. Turkmen along this route here, I think it's important, those of you who are Ottomanist, my understanding is that during the Ottoman Empire, they would always put their own people in important cities along the transportation routes. So there are large, fairly large numbers in Kirkuk, and it's an endless fight as to whether there are more Kurds or more Turkmen. But Kirkuk is a mixed city, and I think it is, the city itself, probably more Turkmen than Kurdish. Also want to remind you that for much of their history over the past few decades, these two political parties have dominated Iraqi Kurdistan. The Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is run by the Barzani family, it's largely tribal, quite disciplined. They are based in Erbil, which is the capital. The PUK was kind of forged out of the left wing of the KDP a number of years ago, headed by Jalal Talabani. They've always ruled this area. In the 90s, when they were self-governing from like 92 after the war with Kuwait and Iraq and the US, they were governing themselves. They were left to themselves. They were governing. This broke down into fratricide, and so you had, even when I first got there in like 99, 2000, two different cantons, the PUK running out of running out of Suleimania in the southeast, and the KDP up in the northwest, out of Erbil. And they've had this kind of fraught relationship this entire time. They officially joined after '04, but it's still, and people are worried right now that they're going to break down into that. There are major checkpoints between these two areas even today. Okay, the bad. I won't make you understand. There will be a test. This is a joke, of course, but when I think about trying to sketch out relationships for my students, I realize it would end up looking like this, and I go, oh my God, I can't do this. But most of the bad over the past 6 months has stemmed from this referendum that the Kurds held. They, just for a little bit of historical background, they were supposed to have a referendum by the Constitution. It was written in the Constitution. They were supposed to have a referendum by 2007, I believe. And this never happened because by then Iraq was pretty much embroiled in a civil war between Shia and Sunni. The Kurds were largely outside of that, at times mediating between the two, but weren't really a part of it. Lots and lots of IDPs fled up into Iraqi Kurdistan, and the official government are these three provinces, Suleimani, Erbil, and Duhok. And this came on, like I said, in 1999. And I guess they recently carved out Halabja. That must have been quite recent. Anyway, this referendum that was supposed to happen in 2007 did not. And so the Kurds just kind of put it off. And then earlier this last year in the spring, the president of the Kurdistan region, Masoud Barzani, announced they were going to have this referendum on September 25th, and they were going to ask not only the people in Kurdistan, but in the disputed areas, which are areas that are under Peshmerga control, because when ISIS came in to Mosul up here, and if you recall, the Iraqi troops largely ran away. The Peshmerga secured Kirkuk and a couple of other places. And so they control a fairly large area that was under Peshmerga control, under Kurdish control, since ISIS came in. And there are other areas that the Kurds have always said really should be ours, down in here, Kifri Kalar, Hanakin, down in this area, along the Iranian border. So this has been an issue of dispute anyway. It was supposed to be negotiated and settled. It wasn't. The Kurds said, okay, we're going to hold this referendum, and all these people in the disputed areas can vote too. Baghdad was not happy with this. Nobody was happy with this. The timing was really, really bad. I mean, even me sitting back in Tucson, last summer, I'm emailing saying, why are you guys doing this now? What is this? Why the timing is just wrong. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. Everyone told them it was wrong. And it was wrong for a number of reasons, I think. And, immediately Turkey said, don't do this. Iran said, don't do this. The European Union said, don't do this. The Americans said, don't do this. And it seemed that the only person who was hell-bent on doing it was President Masoud Barzani. And I don't know, we haven't figured out if it was a naked emperor situation where nobody dared tell him that this was a really bad idea, or from what I understand, some people were telling him that this was a bad idea. He had, I think, some American advisors, some longtime advisors who were saying, no, go for it. The Americans will back you up. Look at what you just did for them. You just routed ISIS. They'll take care of you. They'll back you up. Bad timing for a number of reasons. Partially, they had just finished this work in this horrible conflict in Mosul. A lot of Peshmerga had been killed, a lot injured. It was not a pretty situation. Also, of course, ISIS had taken the Zanger region with the Yazidis. Some people say a genocide happened. They're still finding mass graves of Yazidis in that region. The reason that ISIS was able to overrun the Yazidi area, the Yazidis are not people of the book, so they have no protection at all for people like ISIS. They're considered complete infidels, and therefore subject to enslavement and murder, and a lot were. But the reason that they were caught by ISIS was because the KDP Peshmerga, their fighters, withdrew from that area and moved back towards Erbil to protect Erbil. And a lot of people have not forgiven them for that, especially the Yazidis, needless to say. So huge numbers of Yazidis in displacement camps. This land has now been taken back, of course, and the Yazidis are starting to move back, but it's a real mess. But this is part of the reason why it was such a bad timing. People were ticked off with everybody. The Kurds have a population, I believe I said, of about 5 million in northern Iraq, maybe 5.2, nobody knows. Nobody wants to take a census of any of the Kurdish areas in any of the countries, as far as I know. And they've taken in nearly 2 million refugees and internally displaced people. So if you can imagine in this Kurdistan region, if you can imagine having a population of 5 million and taking in nearly 2 million refugees and displaced people, it's a huge, there's camps everywhere, huge financial strain. And of course the international community has helped a lot. The UN is there, a lot of people, but as my students in my crises class now know, the more money that goes in for humanitarian aid, the more money goes into pockets of usually corrupt political elite, which is the case there. And the big kahuna always, the big problem is oil. What happened after the regime fell in 2003 was the Kurds said, yippee, finally we can start contracting with companies to explore and get oil that we know is in our region. The Big Daddy oil field is here by Kirkuk, this darker one. This is the Baba Gurgur oil field. Yes. I love saying that word, Baba Gurgur. So it's the Big Daddy, and it's been there a long time. And this is largely why the central government and the Kurds have never been able to come to a satisfactory agreement, because the Kurds want that oil, because that's what's going to sustain their independence. Needless to say, Baghdad does not want them to have that oil. They want it too. And no one's been able to agree. But they found a lot of new oil fields near Tuk-Tuk, Chamchamal, these areas. So there's a lot of new oil fields. And the Kurds started making contracts independently with oil companies, right? Central government said, oh no, you've got to go through the Ministry of Oil, you're part of Iraq. And the Kurds said, nah, screw you, you won't give us any of the money. And Baghdad said, yes, we're giving you 17% of our federal budget. That was supposed to be the deal, that the Kurdish region gets 17% of the federal budget. And the Kurds said, look, you've never given us 17% yet, and why should we trust you? And we're just going to go ahead and do our oil exploration. And the central government said, fine, we're cutting you off from the money. And the Kurds said, we don't care, we're going to have so much oil money, we don't care. Well, what happened with the oil? First of all, there was a boom. There was a lot of oil, a lot of money. Erbil was like full of oil companies and new jobs and new growth, and a lot of money went into the pockets of the political elite, the KDP in particular, but also in the PUK area. Big new hotels, big new shopping centers, people making lots and lots of money. It really wasn't trickling down particularly well. Surprise, surprise. It was a very typical kind of, feast on the oil and forget about everything else. And then what happened with oil prices a few years ago? Took a dive. So then the Kurds had no money from their oil, or very little. They had no money from the central government. They were financially really, really weak. And that was the main thing I thought was, and a lot of other people I think too, is that you're so financially weak, why would you hold this referendum now when you can't stand up to all these other forces that wish you ill. So because they had no money from the central government or anywhere else, the Kurdish Regional Government had not been paying their employees, right? And the minister, I interviewed the Minister of Finance here in summer of 2016. He said they had, again, of their country of 5 million people, they had 1.4 million people on the government payroll. Now, some of these were legitimate people working, some were ghost workers. I know you're all going, oh my God. Some of them were pensioners. And as he said, they had the money, so they just kept doling it out. 20,000 students are protesting in the street, put them on the payroll. you can buy them off. So this is what happened, and this is why now they're in these big fights now with Baghdad, because Baghdad's saying, okay, we'll start paying your salaries again, but we want all these people who really aren't working off of the payroll. He also told me that he moved all their books over to spreadsheets, to computer spreadsheets, right? And when Baghdad came up to audit, they told him, no, it's got to be in the books. So he had to move everything from back into these big, huge books, handwritten of all their whole budget and everything. So there's that kind of stuff going on. But anyway, a lot of people on the payroll. And again, the corruption. And with the corruption, one thing that the political elite did was buy more media, because there can never be enough. We can never control enough media. And they developed these big, huge news stations. Kurdistan 24, Rudaw, Masroor, who's the head of security, is now running this, or is the money behind Kurdistan 24. The other big news organization, Rudaw, is run by the Prime Minister's money. And this is on top of what media the parties already had, right? So we'll talk about this later in the semester, about the media kind of setup. But this was the kind of backdrop. This was the kind of backdrop to this referendum. The parliament hadn't been meeting in like 2 years. They were financially in the dumps. The two parties were fighting. Some party members were not even allowed to go to Erbil, the capital. I mean, it's just a really, really bad, very weakened situation. But they still, by God, held that referendum on September 25th. It was rather heartwarming. It was wonderful to see people. A lot of people I knew were really, really torn, because they thought the referendum was just wrong. But they couldn't go in and vote no. They just couldn't do that. So anyway, 93% said yes. It was a 72% turnout. And then it got really ugly. The backlash kicked in right away. Again, to remind you of the neighbors who all wished them ill. Turkey said, we're going to close the border. Iran, look at this, look at these borders. Iran said, we're going to close the border. Of course, Syria was already a mess. Baghdad was completely unhappy, and immediately started instituting whatever they could to bring the Kurds to heel. The US didn't back up the Kurds, the EU didn't back up the Kurds, nobody backed up the Kurds, because they all said, we told you so. Why did you hold this referendum now? We're not surprised. So these borders have been closed at different times for different, the oil kept flowing, as I understand, but I understand these borders were closed, different border crossings at different times. The central government said, we're closing down the airports. We control the international airspace over Iraq. We, Baghdad, the central government, we're closing that. Your airports are closed. This was huge for them, because it's so much easier to fly in. You can fly in directly from Europe, and there were dozens of flights every day into both Erbil and Suleimani. This hurt them a lot. Things kind of got worse, but this meant humanitarian aid workers couldn't come in. All the teachers who were staffing all their fancy new private English language grade school, secondary, primary school couldn't get in and out. They talked about sealing off the banks and not allowing any of the banks to go through the central Iraqi bank. Really, really punitive stuff. And then what happened on October 16th was Baghdad militarily moved in and took over Kirkuk, that the Peshmerga, the Kurds, have been controlling since 2014. And took over all of the disputed territory within a few days. People were completely, totally freaked out. And the Peshmerga, who had been here in Kirkuk and holding Kirkuk, there seems to have been a deal cut. It was mostly PUK from Suleimani area here, and this is where I was. They seem to have cut a deal with Iran to, the PUK agreed to just withdraw. And that angered, of course, a lot of people on the other side. But the PUK said, and again, the PUK is broken into like 3 different factions. The PUK said, look, if we hadn't have withdrawn, they would have just slaughtered us anyway. So, you know, why should we lose more Peshmerga when we're going to lose it anyway? But it really freaked people out. And so once again, you saw Kurds fleeing from Kirkuk, long, long lines of cars, and displaced people fleeing from Suleimani and fleeing from Kirkuk up to Hawlir, Erbil, the capital. This freaked everybody out, seeing this number of Kurdish refugees once again. And they, you know, it just led again to this whole sense of unease. Then they moved on and seized all of this disputed territory. So within a few days, the Kurds lost half of the territory that they had been controlling since 2014. Was really difficult for people like me to get accurate information. Well, it was probably harder if you were reading Kurdish, because there's no outside accurate information. There were very few international, none that I know of, in Kirkuk when this happened. It was really hard to tell exactly what happened. In Tuz Hormatu, which is also a very Turkoman, south of Kirkuk, very Turkoman, Kurdish, Arab mixed. There was a lot of violence, and a lot of Kurds fled from there towards Suleimani into other camps. It was really, it was all over in a few days, but it was really, really devastating. And people felt really threatened. They, in particular, when they took back Kirkuk, it was not only Iraqi national forces like regular troops or regular military. It was also a lot of the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shia militias, what do they call them, popular mobilized popular forces or whatever, basically Shia militias. Mostly they are controlled, a lot of them are controlled by Iran directly. Some of them are very local. Some of them have been drawn into the Iraqi army. So there's all kinds of different Hashd groups. And in particular in Tuz Hormatu, there was a local group that was really quite violent, and they were the ones who seemed to have gone after the Kurds in a really violent way. And Amnesty International, thank God, they're the ones who actually documented what happened in Tuz. There's still people who are displaced out of Tuz Hormatu and other areas from this incursion in October. The Kurds felt really, really betrayed. They, you know, and again, you can say, well, everybody told you so. What did you think? But they really thought, we're the ones who fought against ISIS. We're the ones who stood up to them, and now you're going to punish us. And things got really, really ugly. Things were really ugly. There was a lot of social media. I'll cover that real quick in a minute. But right after this happened, Jalal Talabani, who had been for decades the head of the PUK, died. It was not unexpected. He'd been sick for a while. He'd not been actively involved in politics. But having him die, and he was big in Suleimania, obviously, where I was, people were, again, just like stunned with this death. And then next, well, Noshirwan Mustafa had already died. He had started the change movement, which had really captured the imagination of a lot of young people, and was a huge threat to the other two parties. Khosrat Rasul, who was like a big Peshmerga commander, beloved by lots of people until he got really corrupt, he got very ill. And so there was just this sense that the old way was going behind. Which people were quite happy to see the old guard. I mean, it led to the kind of sense of unsettlement. But on the other hand, people were sick of these parties. They're totally disgusted with these parties. They were totally disgusted with Barzani. They were not unhappy to see these parties really taking a hit. And as I'll explain a little bit more if we have time, the problem is that there's nothing to replace them, because there were no institutions to bring young people up. And the young people wanted nothing to do with these parties. They just saw them as just leading the Kurds, who'd been at this pinnacle with oil wealth and totally connected to the outside world, and people, going to visit and their relatives in Europe and the U.S. and traveling all over the place. And these guys had just brought them down to nothing. So they were disgusted with these parties. Again, the central government the Media Commission closed down the main Kurdish media outlets, which was really pretty outrageous. I think they're back up, but stuff like that was happening. A lot of media forced out, and they were all over Iraq, and they have bureaus all over Iraq. A cameraman in Dak, took me a long time. I was thinking, is that Tak, and that's just spelled different, or is it's a different town? Brutally killed, and we think by Hashid forces, brutally stabbed in front of his family. Stuff like that was happening. And then there was an earthquake, and people are like, Mother Nature, you too? I mean, can't we catch a break here? So people were reeling by November, and these earthquakes, these aftershocks kept happening. I felt the first one was a big one, and we felt it in Suleimania quite strongly. There were like more than 400 people killed. It's right along the Iran-Iraq border, and there have been aftershocks still recently, until quite recently. It just made people feel really, really unsettled. Right before I left, I was meeting students downtown. We were going to go to the bazaar, and I couldn't get close to it. The cab driver went this whole circuitous, oddball way, and I thought, what the hell is he doing over here? And I couldn't get close to it. And finally, I thought there was an accident or something. Finally, I said, just drop me off and I'll walk there. And I finally walked, and I met the students, or not yet. There was a huge demonstration, and there were all these people coming up underneath an underpass along Salam Street, which is the main street through Suleimani. And I thought, oh, there's a couple hundred people there, it's quite a bit. They kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And it was teachers and government workers and all these people who hadn't been paid for years, or who had been on 25% of their salary. They were demonstrating like crazy. They ended up in the big main town square. It was very peaceful. It was like, all these teachers and just regular people who were protesting. This was towards the end of December. This spread immediately to other cities in the PUK area. In the KDP area, they cracked down really hard. They don't allow any protesting. Nobody protests over there. But it spread throughout the cities in the PUK area. And then some of the young people, what we call the angry youth factor, came into play, and they started burning down party headquarters, attacking the police. The PUK sent armored vehicles out into the streets and were shooting at their own people. People were furious that they would do this, and this had only happened maybe once or twice before when there were massive demos a couple years ago. People were furious about all this, that they would shoot on their own people. And again, it was one faction that happened to have a militia who could get their people to go out and shoot. So that, and again, these demonstrations started up again last week because they're still not getting paid. Baghdad has so far refused really to negotiate with the Kurds, so nothing has really happened. They said a couple weeks ago, they were going to start sending money for the employees who were on the government payroll. They didn't do it. Things just really got pretty nasty. And like I said, the angry youth factor is a real, it's going to be a problem in the future. There's nothing to help them. Look at all these Kurdish political parties. I mean, now most of them are small, and I've interviewed all of them. The Toilers are my favorite. But there's still all these like old lefty parties. But the three big ones are the PUK, the KDP, Goran to a lesser extent. But what's coming up here is that there are elections throughout Iraq in May. And so part of the reason why Baghdad and Abadi, the prime minister of Iraq, why he came down so hard on the Kurds was to prove that we can keep these Kurds in control. We can bring them under the wing of Baghdad. We can force them back into the country. And so that was a lot of his reason. It was a lot of political reasoning. He is challenged by Nouri al-Maliki, who was a prime minister before him. And people largely saw Maliki as responsible for totally screwing everything up because he was so vicious and alienated the Sunni Arabs so thoroughly that they joined up with ISIS when they could and cooperated with ISIS in their cities. And so Maliki was seen as responsible for ISIS being existing and taking over half their country. And of course Abadi was seen as forcing ISIS out, and he was the big hero. So of course Abadi wants elections as soon as possible. Maliki wants them later. So the backdrop of a lot of this is also the elections coming up. The Kurds are in complete disarray. Even their single parties are completely, fractured and broken. The KDP is probably the strongest because they still have the tribal roots and all the money. They had all the money. But what people have told me is that somehow, Iraq has come through this and has come out in a more mature political position. That the Sunnis have realized, okay, Iraq is not ours to govern. We are a minority, despite what we used to think. It is not ours, and we can live with the Shia as the dominant people in the government. And this is largely because when the military took back, the Iraqi military took back Mosul and other places in they weren't very nice in Ramadi and Fallujah, but they weren't bad up in Mosul. They treated the people with respect, the largely Sunni people of Mosul. So people think if Abadi is reelected, he will allow space for the Sunni Arabs, and they do need to be a part of the whole process, obviously. And the Shia are a little less, they've kind of moved away from their victim narrative. They've been controlling now for a number of years. It's no longer, oh, we poor Shia, we were oppressed for years, we're not going to give anybody else space, it's our right to put everybody else down because this was done to us. That has kind of abated over the past 15 years, and now finally they're in a more secure position, which means they're not as likely to strike out at the Sunni Arabs. And one would think not the Kurds, but Abadi has really been quite brutal with the Kurds. So we're not sure what that's about other than political posturing. So we're not sure where all this is going. People do think that, some people seem to think that Iraq is at a pretty historic turning point. And we can talk more about politics if you like. It's way too complex for me, frankly, even. But in terms of the Kurds, as a friend said to me the other day, we're still in a wait-and-see position. No one quite knows where this is going to go. They're still not negotiating with Baghdad. They have lost all their friends. They feel completely isolated and up against the wall. They have no political leadership. They have only the corrupt old guard who aren't dying off fast enough. And they have the angry youth factor. And to reflect a headline that I wrote 15 years ago, the Kurds face an uncertain future. So some things never change. All right, questions?